When people talk about the legends of Hollywood's golden age, names like Clark Gable, Humphrey Bogart, and Cary Grant usually dominate the conversation. But tucked among them, with a quiet kind of dignity and an unshakable on-screen presence, was Randolph Scott. A tall, commanding figure with a calm drawl and piercing gaze, Scott became one of the era's most dependable box office draws. But despite a career that spanned over 3 decades and more than 60 films, what intrigued people most about Scott wasn't just his westerns, it was what the cameras didn't capture. Behind the cowboy hat and the studio polish was a man whose private life stirred as much curiosity as his films attracted applause. Scott's reputation as a stoic, gentlemanly actor made him a natural for the roles he played: sheriff, soldier, drifter, always the noble type. But in Hollywood, appearances were everything. And what wasn't shown on the big screen, or rather, what was carefully avoided off of it, was often more compelling than any plotline a script could offer. One name kept resurfacing whenever Scott was mentioned off-set: Cary Grant. Handsome, witty, and charming in a way that made him seem untouchable, Grant was the perfect contrast to Scott's rugged, quiet type. And yet, the two actors shared something that, in 1930s Hollywood, was considered more scandalous than any film noir twist: a life together. They weren't just co-stars. They were roommates, housemates, domestic partners, depending on who you asked and how much you were willing to believe. In the early 1930s, at the height of both men's fame, they shared a Santa Monica beach house that the press dubbed Bachelor Hall. Publicly, it was just two successful men splitting rent and enjoying the California sun. But as fan magazines paraded photos of them grilling burgers in aprons or reading newspapers side by side, speculation grew. Hollywood had its suspicions, but no one dared to say it aloud. And here's where things get interesting. Unlike so many Hollywood legends who carried carefully curated public images, Scott didn't seem particularly interested in putting on a show off camera. He didn't chase scandal, but he also didn't deny his closeness with Grant. That silence, the refusal to clarify, to play the studio's game, only deepened the mystery. Decades later, it wasn't a blockbuster or a film role that made Scott's name trend again. It was a letter. A note, discovered long after his death, containing a quiet confession that would turn decades of whispers into something far more real. But before we get to that letter, the one that would rewrite everything we thought we knew, we need to understand just how powerful and potentially dangerous a bond like theirs was in 1930s Hollywood. Because back then, secrecy wasn't just preferred, it was survival. And the world they were living in, it was built to keep secrets buried. When Randolph Scott and Cary Grant met on the set of Hot Saturday in 1932, no one could have predicted that a single film would ignite one of the most quietly controversial partnerships in Hollywood history. The two leading men couldn't have been more different on paper. Grant, the British-born charmer with a quick wit and dazzling smile, had just begun his climb to stardom. Scott, the Southern gentleman with stoic appeal and deep-set eyes, had already built a solid resume playing honorable, reserved characters. But something clicked, not just professionally, but personally. By the time filming wrapped, their connection was undeniable. Soon after, they made the decision to move in together. The press spun it as a cost-saving move, just two young actors sharing a beach house. But the photographs told a different story. In those snapshots, they weren't just roommates. They looked like a couple building a life. There were candid images of them cooking meals together, lounging in robes on a shared patio, playing tennis in matching outfits. Even for the era, it was unusually domestic. The house in Santa Monica became known as Bachelor Hall, and it quickly developed a reputation. Fan magazines gushed over their bromance, framing it all as charming and playful. But Hollywood insiders whispered a different version. They saw the subtle gestures, the comfortable closeness, the kind of body language that couldn't be staged, not entirely. To some, it was obvious. To others, it was an open question. But to the studios, it was a problem. This was the early 1930s. The Hays Code, the strict moral guideline for film content, was just beginning to take hold. Hollywood was already under pressure to present a sanitized, all-American image to the public. If a leading man was rumored to be gay, or even just too close to another man, it could cost him his career. Which meant Scott and Grant's friendship wasn't just unusual. It was dangerous. Studio heads weren't about to take chances. Not with two rising stars. Soon, the pressure started mounting. Interviews were carefully filtered. Public appearances were managed down to the detail. Grant, under significant pressure from Paramount, entered a short-lived marriage with actress Virginia Cherrill in 1934. It lasted barely a year, and when it ended, he moved right back in with Scott, something that did not go unnoticed. Still, through it all, they remained close. Too close, many said. And while neither man ever publicly confirmed the nature of their bond, their devotion to one another was evident to anyone paying attention. They didn't just share a house. They shared a life. As the years went on, the rumors only intensified. But the pair remained silent, never offering explanations, never issuing denials. And that silence became its own kind of statement, one that would echo through Hollywood for decades to come. But the real turning point wouldn't come until much later, when a private letter emerged, written by Scott, long after the cameras had stopped rolling, and long after the world thought it had moved on. Hollywood in the 1930s wasn't just about glitz and glamour. Behind the red carpets and flashing lights, the movie industry was tightly controlled by a handful of powerful studios. These weren't just production companies, they were image factories with absolute control over their stars' lives. Every public appearance, every romantic rumor, every magazine cover was carefully engineered. And for someone like Randolph Scott, whose close bond with Cary Grant defied convention, the pressure from the top was immediate and intense. The studios weren't naive. They knew that perception sold tickets. And for leading men like Scott and Grant, the expectation was simple: masculinity, charm, and above all else, heterosexual appeal. Anything that challenged that, even the hint of a different narrative, had to be handled. Quietly, ruthlessly. By the mid-1930s, gossip columns were buzzing about the duo's unusual living arrangement. Though the public ate up the Bachelor Hall story, insiders were growing nervous. Behind closed doors, studio executives held meetings, discussed strategies, and started pushing for ways to divert attention. The easiest solution? Manufacture heterosexual relationships that looked good in the press. That's how Cary Grant's first marriage came to be. In 1934, he wed actress Virginia Cherrill, a union that raised eyebrows almost as quickly as it settled them. There was little chemistry, less time spent together, and by 1935, it was over. Divorce papers were filed, and the media moved on. But Hollywood noticed something more telling. Grant moved right back in with Randolph Scott. It was as if nothing had changed. For studio bosses, this wasn't acceptable. They began issuing ultimatums, subtle but serious. Grant's career had too much momentum. Scott was too closely tied to him. Rumors, left unchecked, could derail everything. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted for both men to separate, or at the very least, to be seen dating women. Not for love, for optics. At the same time, studios leaned on the media. Tabloid writers were warned. Columnists were offered exclusives as long as they didn't touch certain subjects. Any journalist who got too close to the truth found themselves mysteriously out of favor. Hollywood's golden rule applied: protect the product, no matter what. Meanwhile, Scott kept his head down. He was never one for scandal, and he didn't crave the spotlight off screen. He continued working steadily, mostly in westerns, films where he played the strong, silent hero, always getting the girl, always riding off into the sunset. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew him personally. In real life, Scott was neither chasing damsels nor riding alone. He had built a quiet, private life with a man who understood the same pressures and shared the same secret. Still, the weight of those secrets took a toll. Living under constant scrutiny, performing a role even when the cameras weren't rolling, it wasn't just exhausting. It was dehumanizing. And all the while, Hollywood's carefully crafted illusion held strong. But illusions don't last forever. And for Scott, the truth would eventually find its way to the surface, not through a scandal or a tell-all, but through something far more personal, a letter that no one was ever supposed to read. For nearly a dozen years, Randolph Scott and Cary Grant shared a life that many suspected but few dared to name. In the golden glow of Hollywood's golden age, they were seen dining together, vacationing together, even posing for photos on the front steps of their shared beachside home, grinning like newlyweds. To fans, it was charming. To the studios, it was risky. And to the men themselves, it was something far more fragile, a kind of sanctuary, constantly at risk of being shattered. The term domestic partnership didn't exist back then. There was no public framework to describe what they had. And so Scott and Grant never did. They never gave interviews about each other. Never explained, never clarified. But their actions told the story anyway. They lived as a couple, even if no one ever dared to print that word. Some insiders knew. A few close friends suspected more than they admitted. But the silence around them was both self-imposed and enforced by the system they worked in. In private, they built routines. Simple, quiet joys. Early morning coffee on the patio. Late-night walks along the beach. Matching monogrammed towels. They hosted dinner parties, carefully curated guest lists. No press allowed. Some described the vibe of those nights as unspoken understanding. Others felt it was something deeper, a private world they let a lucky few glimpse for just a moment. But the deeper their bond grew, the heavier the burden became. By the 1940s, both men were well-established stars. Scott had become one of the top names in westerns, often playing hardened loners with hearts of gold. Grant was now a full-blown international icon, the face of charm and elegance in films like The Philadelphia Story and Notorious. Their careers soared, but the cost of that success was steep. The spotlight grew hotter, the rumors louder, the pressure unbearable. And eventually, it became clear they couldn't keep living like this. Not in that house, not in that era. At some point, even quiet love becomes too loud for the world that refuses to hear it. Their separation wasn't public. There was no breakup announcement, no scandal in the tabloids. It just happened. Quietly, Scott moved out. Grant married again. The photo ops returned, this time with beautiful actresses by their side. The illusion was back in place. But those who knew Scott say something changed in him after that. He remained the consummate professional, filming iconic Western after Western, but something deeper, something softer, seemed to fade. He no longer smiled quite the same way in press photos. His interviews became more reserved. The twinkle that once sparked in his quiet moments, the one fans had noticed when he sat beside Grant, wasn't there anymore. Decades passed. The world changed. But the question remained, lingering like the final frame of a black and white film. What was lost in those silent years? What did Scott leave behind when he walked away from that house, and from the one person who may have understood him best? The answer, or at least a piece of it, wouldn't be revealed until long after the credits rolled on his life. In a letter no one was ever meant to find. It's been said that Hollywood keeps its secrets buried beneath layers of gold and glamour. The films, the parties, the endless smiles, they're all part of an elaborate performance. But sometimes, if you look hard enough, the truth breaks through the cracks. And in Randolph Scott's case, that truth came not in a public scandal or through a tell-all book, but in something far more personal and unexpected, a letter. It wasn't until years after his death, in 1987, that the letter was found. A simple note, tucked away in a forgotten drawer of a desk at his former home in Beverly Hills. No one knew it was there. The world had long since turned its back on the notion of Scott and Grant as anything more than just co-stars and friends. But this letter, a confession from Scott himself, would reopen an old wound and rewrite everything we thought we knew about him. It wasn't just a letter, it was a window into the private life of one of Hollywood's most enigmatic figures. The contents of that note were simple, written in Scott's precise handwriting. It wasn't the kind of dramatic, verbose revelation you might expect from a movie script. No, this was raw, unflinching honesty. Scott wrote about his love for Grant, about the years they spent together, and about the deep, painful knowledge that their bond could never be fully accepted by the world they lived in. In it, he detailed not just the warmth and comfort of their companionship, but also the constant struggle of hiding in plain sight. Scott acknowledged the toll it had taken on both of them, the way they had to live in the shadows, even as their love burned brightly. But most shockingly, Scott revealed something that few people had suspected. He knew that their bond, their secret, could never be revealed, not in his lifetime, not in Grant's. Hollywood wasn't ready for it, and neither were they. The letter wasn't long. It didn't dwell on regrets. There were no dramatic accusations or tears on the page. Instead, it was a quiet confession, one full of acceptance. It was Scott's way of finally putting his truth into words, even though he knew the world might never fully understand. He knew what was at stake, his career, his reputation, his relationship with the man he loved. But he was also painfully aware that some truths were never meant to be spoken out loud. Hollywood was a place where love, like everything else, was commodified. Their love had been real, but it was one they had to keep locked away. The discovery of the letter didn't make headlines right away. It wasn't like one of those grand, posthumous revelations where everything is exposed in a moment of shock. No, this letter surfaced quietly, passed from person to person among a small circle of friends and confidants. But each person who read it was struck by the same thing: the profound depth of Scott's emotions, the quiet dignity with which he had carried his love all those years. And as word began to spread, so too did the realization. Scott had left behind more than just a career full of iconic westerns. He had left behind a secret history, one that was finally ready to be acknowledged. As the letter spread among a close-knit group of Scott's confidants, it became clear that it was more than just an intimate admission. It was a statement, a legacy, and in its quiet, understated way, it began to reshape how people viewed Randolph Scott. The stoic actor who had played strong, silent cowboys and unflappable heroes on screen had, in truth, been living a quiet but deeply emotional life off-screen. His dedication to keeping his love for Cary Grant under wraps was not out of shame, but out of necessity. It wasn't just about the fear of scandal. It was about survival in a time when the mere suggestion of a romantic relationship between two men could derail not only their careers but their lives. Hollywood, in all its glitzy exterior, had its darker side, and its standards were often unforgiving. But Scott's letter, discovered long after his career had ended, opened up a conversation that had been long avoided. It wasn't just about the secrecy of his relationship with Grant. It was about the larger pattern of silence that had been woven into the fabric of their careers. For decades, both men had lived in the shadow of the studios, knowing that the truth of their connection could ruin them. The letter was a rare glimpse into a world that most had assumed was either non-existent or, at best, a whisper among the most salacious gossip columns. For fans and film historians alike, the letter was a revelation, not because it uncovered scandal, but because it revealed something far more powerful: the humanity behind the icon. Randolph Scott wasn't just the tough cowboy with a hidden vulnerability. He was a man deeply in love, who sacrificed pieces of himself to fit the mold Hollywood had built for him. He wasn't an actor playing a role on screen. He was a man playing a role in his own life, carefully navigating the waters of a system that demanded conformity. And then there was Cary Grant. How did he feel when he learned of the letter's existence? It's impossible to know for sure. Grant, too, had always been the picture of a polished, charming, and unattainable figure. His personal life was as tightly controlled as his public persona. But as the years went on, there was a noticeable shift. Grant, who had always dodged questions about his relationship with Scott, began to speak more openly about the bond they shared, though still never naming it as anything more than a close friendship. In interviews, he would refer to Scott as his best friend, and even express admiration for Scott's ability to navigate Hollywood's treacherous waters with such grace. But even as Grant began to open up, the truth of their bond remained largely unspoken. The letter was a part of that truth, a glimpse into what had been hidden for so long. It wasn't a confession of regret or sorrow. Instead, it was an expression of love, of an understanding that the love they shared was both a gift and a burden. For Randolph Scott, keeping his relationship with Grant hidden had been a choice, a painful, necessary one. But the letter he left behind was his way of finally, quietly, and definitively telling his side of the story. He had carried this secret with him for decades. But in the end, it wasn't a burden he left behind. It was a part of his legacy. Hollywood had always loved a good mystery. But what the world didn't know until the letter's discovery was that the greatest mystery of all had been right under their noses, a love story that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. When Randolph Scott's letter first began circulating among those who had known him best, reactions were mixed. For some, the discovery was a shock, not because they doubted the bond between Scott and Cary Grant, but because it had remained so meticulously hidden for so long. How could two men, both legends in their own right, have lived such an extraordinary life without the world catching on? The letter, in its quiet simplicity, was the key to a long-guarded secret that many had suspected but never truly believed. For those closest to Scott, the letter was confirmation of what they had always known. They had seen the subtle glances, the small gestures of affection, the way the two men moved through the world in tandem, as though their lives were inextricably linked. Friends and family of Scott and Grant admitted that, in their quiet moments, they had always sensed there was more to their relationship than met the eye. But even in private, they had respected the boundaries that both men had set, never pushing, never questioning. They understood the stakes. Among the general public, however, the reaction was more varied. The discovery of the letter prompted a flood of articles, think pieces, and retrospectives, but it wasn't all warm and understanding. For some, the revelation was difficult to accept. The idea that two of Hollywood's most iconic stars might have shared a deep, romantic bond was too much for certain segments of the audience to process. Many still clung to the image of the rugged, all-American hero that had been meticulously crafted for Scott and Grant. They didn't want to see that image shattered. Some fans felt betrayed. They had grown up idolizing Scott, looking up to him as the embodiment of masculinity, strength, and quiet dignity. To learn that the man behind the perfect on-screen persona had harbored a secret, and that his love had been forced into the shadows, left some feeling conflicted. Was it all a lie? Had they been sold an illusion? But for others, the revelation was a moment of bittersweet clarity. The letter painted a portrait of two men who had lived within the confines of a system that demanded perfection, conformity, and above all, silence. What had been thought of as a simple partnership, a professional relationship, was recontextualized. The love story that had been hidden for so long was no longer just a rumor or gossip. It was a beautiful, deeply human story of two men who had been forced to sacrifice their truth for the sake of their careers, their image, and their safety. For those who understood the weight of the time in which Scott and Grant had lived, the letter became a symbol, not of betrayal, but of survival. It showed how much these two men had sacrificed, not just for the sake of their own careers, but for the preservation of a love that couldn't be acknowledged publicly. It was a revelation, yes, but also a reminder that Hollywood's star system was never about what it seemed. Beneath the glitz and glamour, there were always people, real people, struggling to live their truth in a world that didn't want to hear it. Cary Grant, in particular, became the subject of a renewed public interest. In the years following the letter's discovery, interviews surfaced where he spoke more openly about his feelings for Scott, albeit still carefully navigating the language of their bond. Though he never publicly confirmed the romantic aspect, it was clear from his tone and choice of words that he cherished their time together. Grant would later reflect on the profound friendship they shared and how it had shaped him in ways that were far beyond the movies. But the truth was that the letter had already done its work. It had given voice to a love that had been quietly lived in the shadows, and it had done so without scandal, without grandiose declarations. It was simple. It was raw. It was the truth of a life lived without apology, in an era where apology was all that could be given. The discovery of Randolph Scott's letter marked a turning point, not only for how the world understood his relationship with Cary Grant, but also for the way Hollywood's history was being rewritten. As time passed, the entertainment industry began to undergo profound changes, and the old guard, the studios that had controlled every aspect of an actor's life, was slowly but surely losing its grip. The letter was discovered at a pivotal moment, when the boundaries of sexuality, identity, and privacy were beginning to shift in popular culture. In the years following the letter's revelation, the tides of Hollywood's golden age continued to recede, leaving behind a new, more open and diverse landscape. The industry, which had once been ruled by powerful executives who dictated the public personas of their stars, began to confront its past and its secrets. More and more stories came to light, stories that had been silenced for decades. As gay rights movements gained momentum in the 1980s and 1990s, Hollywood's history was re-examined through a more critical, inclusive lens. For many in the LGBTQ+ community, the letter was seen not as a scandal, but as a small victory. It represented the courage of two men who had lived their truth quietly, even in an environment that demanded the opposite. The letter offered a glimpse into a world where love and identity could flourish in secrecy, but also highlighted the cost of living in the shadows. It became a powerful symbol of the struggle for visibility, acceptance, and equality, not just in Hollywood, but in society at large. It wasn't just the LGBTQ+ community that responded to the letter with interest and reverence. The larger cultural conversation was also shifting. Hollywood was beginning to realize that the stories it told, both on screen and off, weren't always as simple as the narratives they had presented for decades. The industry's complex history of racism, sexism, and homophobia was coming to light. Stars like Rock Hudson, Marlon Brando, and James Dean were being re-examined through a new lens, and their own stories, once cloaked in mystery, began to unravel. At the same time, the letter prompted a reevaluation of the type of role Scott had played throughout his career. Known for his stoic, unflappable cowboy characters, Scott had long been seen as the embodiment of the American ideal: tough, reliable, and always in control. But as the public began to learn more about the man behind the character, it became clear that Scott's real life was far more nuanced. He had portrayed the rugged individualist on screen, but in reality, he was part of a deep, complex partnership that, for years, had remained hidden from view. The industry's evolving perspective allowed for new types of stories to be told, stories that were more reflective of the world's complexities, including the complexities of love, identity, and the human experience. More openly LGBTQ+ characters began appearing on screen, and stars who had once been forced to hide their personal lives were now speaking out and reclaiming their stories. Scott's letter wasn't just an intimate confession. It became a piece of history, part of the long-overdue reckoning with Hollywood's past. As the years went by, Scott's reputation began to shift. Once viewed as a somewhat aloof, even mysterious figure, he began to be seen as a symbol of quiet strength and personal integrity. The man who had sacrificed so much for his career and for love was now being recognized not just as an actor, but as someone who had weathered the harshest of Hollywood storms. His ability to maintain a private life under such intense scrutiny became a mark of resilience and grace. In the end, the letter that had been hidden away for so many years wasn't just a glimpse into Randolph Scott's personal life. It was a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who lived in the shadows, a reminder that the stories we thought we knew were often just the surface. And in the case of Randolph Scott and Cary Grant, the truth of their bond wasn't something that could ever be fully explained. But the letter, in all its quiet simplicity, provided a piece of the puzzle, and perhaps most importantly, a reason to stop seeing their story as a scandal and start seeing it as what it truly was, a love story. The uncovering of Randolph Scott's letter did more than just offer a glimpse into the private life of a Hollywood legend. It forced a complete reevaluation of his legacy, one that extended far beyond his iconic Western roles. For decades, Scott had been defined by the roles he played, the quiet, tough cowboys who never flinched in the face of danger. These characters became synonymous with masculinity, strength, and stoic resolve. But as his letter became public knowledge, the world began to see Scott through a different lens, as a man who had carried his own emotional weight in silence, struggling with the reality of his love for Cary Grant in a time when such a relationship could destroy everything. What was once an image of the rugged hero was now viewed as a man caught in the crosshairs of an industry that demanded perfection, both on screen and off. Hollywood had shaped him into the ideal leading man, and while Scott excelled in this role, it came with an emotional toll. The letter revealed that his stoic demeanor, often lauded as part of his on-screen charm, was also a product of the deep internal conflict he faced throughout his life. This insight humanized him in a way that many of his fans had never considered. The public image of Scott, that pillar of masculinity, was inextricably linked to his silence, a silence that had been a necessity for survival in a time when being open about one's personal life could lead to ruin. As the years passed and the letter continued to circulate, the narrative around Scott began to shift. No longer just the cool, detached cowboy, Scott became a symbol of the quiet resistance to an industry that demanded conformity. The quiet strength that he had displayed in his personal life was now recognized as just as significant as his on-screen heroism. His ability to navigate a world that wasn't ready for his truth became part of the larger narrative of Hollywood's struggle with issues of identity, representation, and visibility. This new understanding didn't just affect how Scott was viewed by his fans. It also impacted the way Hollywood began to look at itself. The industry had long upheld an idealized version of its stars, creating facades that protected both their public personas and the studio system's interests. But with the revelation of Scott's letter and the way it shook up the established narrative, the walls around Hollywood's image began to crack. The industry began to grapple with its past mistakes, acknowledging the deep silences and erasures that had been forced upon its stars. For future generations of actors, the story of Randolph Scott became a lesson in both courage and sacrifice. His story wasn't just about how he had hidden his love for Cary Grant. It was about how he had lived a life true to himself, even when that meant taking the hard path. The letter, more than anything, embodied the conflict between personal happiness and professional survival in a world that wasn't ready to accept that love could take many forms. In the years that followed, the legacy of Randolph Scott was redefined by those who had come to understand the quiet strength behind his work. His story became part of the broader conversation about the changing face of Hollywood, a conversation that included struggles with representation, complexity of identity, and the ongoing fight for equality. The letter that had once been a private admission became a public testament to the human heart, a heart that had been locked away for so long, finally freed. Today, when people speak of Randolph Scott, they do so with a new appreciation, not just for the man who brought the cowboy to life on screen, but for the man who, in his own quiet way, fought to live authentically in a world that wasn't always kind to those who dared to be themselves. The letter had completed the final chapter of his legacy, one that went beyond the image he had spent his life crafting. It was, in many ways, the most heroic role he had ever played. As the dust settled after the letter's revelation, one thing became undeniably clear. Randolph Scott's life and legacy were far more complicated and profound than anyone had realized. The discovery of the letter didn't just unveil a hidden chapter in the actor's personal history, it brought to the forefront a deeper, universal truth about the nature of love, sacrifice, and the human desire for authenticity. For years, Scott had been a symbol of stoic masculinity, his carefully curated public persona as the ultimate cowboy, leaving little room for anything less than perfection. Yet, in the private corners of his life, he had faced the same struggles that so many before him had endured: the longing for love, the desire for personal truth, and the pain of living in a world that didn't always allow people to be themselves. The letter he left behind was his quiet declaration, not of guilt, not of shame, but of the recognition that some truths are simply too powerful to be hidden forever. In the context of Hollywood's history, Scott's story was part of a larger, ongoing narrative of men and women who had been forced to conceal their true selves. For decades, the industry had cultivated a facade of perfect stars, carefully protected from anything that might tarnish their image. But Scott's letter challenged that facade, pushing back against the notion that an actor's life could be separated from the roles they played. It called into question the cost of fame and the price one paid to be both a public figure and a private person in an unforgiving world. Ultimately, the letter did not just alter how we viewed Randolph Scott. It transformed the way we looked at the entire history of Hollywood. It opened the door for future generations to understand that the true stories of these stars were far more complex than the carefully curated narratives. It became part of the movement to reclaim the voices of those who had been silenced for so long, not just in Hollywood, but in society at large. The legacy of Randolph Scott, once defined by the roles he played, was now defined by the truth he had kept hidden for so long. He had been a man caught between the pressures of a studio system that demanded conformity and the deep, undeniable love he had for another man. And though the world may never fully comprehend the depth of that relationship, the letter allowed us to see the humanity behind the image, the quiet heroism of a man who had lived his truth, even in silence. Now, as we reflect on Scott's life and career, we can do so with a sense of gratitude for the message his story brings. It reminds us that the truth, no matter how long it takes to be revealed, will always find its way to the surface. And when it does, it has the power to change everything. For Randolph Scott, that truth may have come too late for him to fully experience the freedom of public acceptance, but in the end, his letter allowed the world to know him for who he truly was. The final truth, after all, isn't just about who we are in the public eye. It's about who we are when the curtains fall, when the cameras are turned off, and when we are left to live as our truest selves. Randolph Scott's story, and the letter that revealed it, is a testament to the enduring power of love, courage, and the never-ending fight for authenticity in a world that often demands conformity. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we stop looking at Hollywood's legends solely through the lens of their public images. After all, it's the untold stories, the ones whispered in letters left behind, that carry the greatest weight.